In a faraway slice of the Megaverse, the inhabitants of Flova are preparing for a mission to a mysterious, primitive planet. What they find there will change the course of their history forever. And maybe yours, too. Put on some headphones and harness the power of your imagination with the illustrated podcast, Flovatar, a Dust Odyssey.
That's it! It will be at the diner. Keep the 3D glasses.
He winked at Mel.
Sell them to some billionaire and retire. You've earned them.
When the Flovans exited the museum, they were shocked to find hundreds of teenagers, stay-at-home moms, politicians, and wannabe singers waiting for them outside of the entrance. It seems their presence in the city hadn't gone unnoticed by the general public after all. Museum security had spotted Franklin and Paul inside the Egyptian section, but instead of calling the police, they called the current reigning authority on Earth, social media influencers. The mob descended on the Flovans, asking them for selfies, including them in outrageous dances and begging them to engage in a form of torture they called a collab. A petite woman recognized Gellin from the viral video Super Strong Kid remix and shoved her cell phone in his face to record his top 10 secrets for a jacked bod. As she swiped through her social media feed at a rapid pace, Gellin realized that their mission counterparts were taking advantage of this fame on other parts of the globe. He recognized the fellow cadet from basic training, Marlin, who was dressed as a Sith Lord and posing with fans in a ghastly place called Florida. The Flovans' presence was being commercialized, and it was only a matter of time before they were going to be pushed onto the morning talk show circuit and forced to eat spicy buffalo wings. Gellin pulled each Flovan free from the masses and hurried them away from the museum. The horde of attention-hungry humans swarmed after them, sacrificing their bodies in traffic to get the perfect angle for the next post. They arrived at the diner with only minutes to spare. As the humans tried to pile into the diner, the fry cook from the night before stopped them in their tracks.
Hey!
A man with abnormally large lips and a chiseled jaw shouted.
Is there any food here I could take photos of for my followers?
The fry cook tossed a slice of bacon at his face and locked the door. A glowing, multicolored porthole barely the size of a basketball floated near the back of the walk-in freezer.
This is it! We're going home!
Not exactly. We're going on an adventure. The only portholes I've been able to identify have led to other Earth locations. I need to find out more about how the Portalium got into this particular Game Boy. We're going back to the location of its invention to look for clues as to why.
I ain't fitting through here,
Grievous moaned.
But didn't you say it was invented more than 40 years ago? What if we can't find a trace of the original blueprints?
Nostos grinned.
Then we will have to go back to 1988. Gellin, will you lead us in? Oh, and a tip. Try to land on your knees.
For the second time in the past few days, Gellin was asked to lead his fellow Flovans into an unknown portal of time and space. But this time, he wasn't nervous or afraid. This time, he knew that the lives of his friends depended on it. He held his breath and jumped headfirst toward destiny. When the Flovans back home would inevitably ask Gellin to explain what the journey through the porthole felt like, he would compare his bones to water squeezed through a skinny rubber tube, like the ones they used to irrigate the crops on the biospheres. The shock of the suction was nothing compared to the harshness of the landing when they were all spit out at their destination. All of the travelers except Nostos and Floyd landed face first into intricately shaped shrubs.
Welcome to Kyoto in the year 1988. Next stop, Nintendo HQ,
Nostos announced as Franklin pulled a boxwood leaf out of her ear. Taking in the sights of 1980s Japan, Franklin remarked that compared to the buildings in their previous location, this place was a downright fantasy land. Triangular thatched roofs were stacked on top of each other, creating a symmetrical feel that tickled her scientific sensibilities. She took out her Philosophlo to identify the explosion of trees in the area, adorned with pink blossoms that hung over the pathways like caring grandmothers, waiting to serve you another fluff cake.
This flora only blooms once a year for about a month,
she exclaimed in Paul's direction. Why had she told him that? Why did she think he would care? She pretended to scribble notes in her digipad and scanned the area with Nostos' Dustbuster. Rebus snorted.
What's the point of them if they only comes round once a year?
Paul looked at him like if there were less witnesses in the park, he might send a roundhouse kick to Rebus's face.
The experience of only seeing them for a small amount of time makes them special, I think. The knowledge that things change with the seasons makes you appreciate what you have right now. Use your stupid streamer to show the masses on Flova how beautiful life is when it's not tailored to their every need.
Rebus leered at this rare appearance of Paul's soft underbelly. He fiddled with his equipment and powered it on to investigate the chubby bronze statues around him.
The porthole took us to exactly 1 year before the release of the Game Boy. I need to know how and why some of them were produced with the Porthalium integrated into their CPUs.
Ah, right. CPUs,
said Gellin, with an exaggerated nod of his lime green head.
Remind the rest of them what CPUs are.
Nostos, Franklin, Floyd, Fasco answered harmoniously like a barbershop quartet.
Central Processing Unit.
Following the signs for the train, they navigated around hordes of people moving in and out of the station like a typical morning at the Starflux. Fasco marveled that this many people could coordinate their movements without AT. She could still feel a trace of hers in her ear after she had taken it out. It was like losing a limb. In a trance, she leaned onto Floyd and stumbled when she realized he wasn't by her side per usual. He was investigating a turnstile, and frankly, he was all up in his business. While Franklin and Nostos managed to secure them all one-way tickets, Paul swiped a green tea and some colorful Japanese candy from a convenience stall. He sniffed the air. Not much sign of dust here. He patted his pocket. The Pineapple Dreams baggie had made it through the porthole.
Let's go. We've only a few minutes until the train leaves the station.
Like he's at breakfast time, the Flovans marched toward the turnstiles. Gellin went first, holding his ticket above his head and plunging forward, expecting the metal arms to open for him. Instead, he was punched in the gut by the barrier.
I believe you have to enter your tickets through that slot before you can go in. This was cutting-edge tech in the 1980s here on Earth, but certainly doesn't compare to...
Without waiting for Nostos to finish his drawn-out explanation, Gellin thrust the turnstile arm forward, ripping the silver bar from its socket. He stepped through triumphantly, just as an alarm blared through the station and 6 security guards descended toward him. Nostos tried to call them off, but his translation device, further bugged by the journey through the previous porthole, sabotaged his efforts. When he tried to explain to the guards that Gellin was his brother, he instead informed them that Gellin was the devil. In the middle of the hubbub, the train arrived at the station and Franklin began to panic. Paul reached in his pocket, pulled out a few sticky leaves and offered them to the security guards in exchange for Gellin's freedom. Just like on Flova, official security could always be bribed with illegal goods. Some things are true across the Megaverse. The guards sauntered away, exclaiming their luck at procuring what they thought were some of the rarest matcha leaves in existence. Rebus stepped through the doors mere seconds before they closed, nearly dropping his streamer. The train accelerated rapidly, and they all scrambled to find seats. At the next stop, a disheveled businessman sat down in a row opposite Rebus and absent-mindedly fidgeted with an LCD calculator. The sound of the buttons clicking irked Franklin to no end, and she stared daggers toward the poor accountant who had no conscious clue he was riling her up. Before she snapped, another passenger came into her view. He was also focused on the irritating fellow in the wrinkled suit, but he wasn't enraged. He was enthralled, watching his fingers intently. It was then Franklin zeroed in on the badge around his neck.
Nostos, look at his identification marker.
The logo on the badge was the same as the name embossed on the Game Boy, Nintendo. The name on the badge read Gunpei Yokoi, more famously known as the inventor of the Game Boy. Nostos was too preoccupied fidgeting with the Game Boy, trying to beat the next level of Tetris. Fasco grinned at him.
Need my help yet?
She teased, leaning forward with her violent bangs between headrests.
I might need more than that. I'm not sure how this will function to find another porthole. I've clearly never gotten this far.
Yokoi turned his attention from the businessman to Nostos. He locked in on the Game Boy and suddenly looked like he needed to take an emergency trip to the bathroom. Fighting the urge, he approached Nostos and inquired, not so casually, about the device in his hand. Nostos froze. This particular Game Boy hadn't technically been produced yet. He risked upending the natural order of linear time if he gave the incorrect answer.
This? This. It's merely a heart rate monitor. Yep, and mine is through the roof right now, it seems.
Yokoi cocked his head to the side as he tried to steal a glimpse of the screen. Nostos covered the Nintendo logo with his hand.
Interesting,
Yokoi replied.
A high-powered LCD screen device that fits perfectly with the shape of your hand. That looks like technology we would be interested in studying at Nintendo. Would you like to come with me to our headquarters? I'll even throw in some passes for your friends for our exclusive tour.
Nostos was gobsmacked. It was almost too easy. He agreed, and the Flovans followed Yokoi off the train at the Fushimi Inari station. While they exited the train, the previously bored accountant wrote something in his notebook. Ask R&D to look into integrating the Hedgehog into a handheld game that you can play on the train. Feeling like VIPs, the Flovans filed into the dull, gray Nintendo HQ building as they prepared for the grand tour. Yokoi asked the woman at the front desk to take them on the first leg of the exclusive tour. She seemed confused, and Yokoi hastily whispered in her ear, pointing to Nostos and the Game Boy. Nodding, she sprang up and escorted the Flovans through a pair of doors labeled Engineering. If they had expected a lab of complex equipment, apparatuses, circuits, and rigs, their hopes were deflated faster than a balloon festival in a pine forest. Rows and rows of cubicles formed a maze of corporate cages, with only the tiniest slivers of the tops of human heads to be seen.
This seems like a cult that pledged to shower the least amount possible,
Paul muttered under his breath. He couldn't tell if the smell was from dust or from the engineers, but the mixture was enough to make his eyes water. Unfortunately, it didn't look like any of these inhabitants were going to hook him up with the remedy he needed, so he'd have to siphon off some more of his supply before the end of the tour. The underwhelming expedition continued through the cafeteria, where workers shoved fists full of sushi into their mouths and read the latest newspapers.
Nostos, who is Cher?
Vasco inquired, seeing a headline and a photo of a beautiful woman on one of the front pages.
After we take this tour, I'm going to find you a Walkman and educate you on the last 60 years of Earth music. I'm sure whatever music Damus is force-feeding you on Flova is dreadful. He had the worst taste.
They were quickly herded through the dining room and toward the executive offices. Franklin began to feel that something was rotten, and it wasn't just the leftover sashimi piling up in the trash cans. There were no other tour groups that she had seen in this building. The receptionist seemed to have limited knowledge about the history of the company or even what project each department was working on. She wished she had her AT device back right about now. It was extremely inefficient to ascertain danger without it.
Yokoi is waiting for you in his office,
The nervous secretary announced to the Flovans. She ushered them into a compact room filled with the wildest gadgets they had ever seen. Gellin picked up the crisscross plastic widget with tongs called the Ultra Hand and poked Floyd with it. Franklin made sure to put as much space between the love tester, a sketchy gadget with metal handles on either side, and her as possible. Statues of small Italian plumbers were used as paperweights on top of stacks nearly ceiling high. It was the office of some sort of genius or madman, and the next situation indicated that it might be more of the latter. Yokoi and 5 other men entered the office looking very inhospitable. It seemed less and less likely that they were going to get a commemorative cup at the end of this tour.
Hand over the stolen goods and nobody gets hurt,
he instructed Nostos. It was surprisingly amusing to Nostos, the way Yokoi was posturing to look larger than he was. He recognized himself in the man, a tinkerer at heart, whose brain was all he usually used as protection. Gunpei Yokoi may have had more hair than Nostos at the moment, but it was graying at the edges and the deep wrinkles between his eyes were set into deep crevices. Yokoi continued, his voice cracking.
If you indicate who you planted as a spy inside of our company, we may even let you stay out of prison. You will have to turn over all the technology you have taken from us to use in your own inventions, of course. Gentlemen.
Nostos bowed toward the executives.
I do not mean to be disrespectful, but as fellow technology enthusiasts, I fear I must warn you that I have an android in this room who can tear you all to pieces upon my command.
They looked skeptically at Floyd, still rocking his tiny pair of swim trunks and a silk shirt Fasco snagged from a vendor at the train station. Nostos commanded Floyd to.
Don't smash that pleasant-looking statue with the mustache.
And Floyd obliterated the Mario figurine with one swipe. Yokoi recoiled in fear.
Who do you work for? Sega? Atari? Not Sony. They're my friends, but oh my, you are a fool if you think you will ever put out an operational console. We don't work for any of them. We're not even from this planet. This Game Boy in my pocket is your invention. Look.
He passed the device to Yokoi and showed him the Nintendo label, embossed under the screen.
But this is not what the Game Boy looks like. Not yet, I suppose.
Nostos smiled warmly. After a bit of coaxing, Yokoi and the other executives took the group to the research and development department. This was clearly not part of the tour, if there really was any tour at all. This lab was pulsing with inventions and innovations. He led them to the middle of the floor where his prototype Game Boy sat under a glass case. It was twice the size of Nostos' Game Boy, with at least 10 buttons, a less impressive screen, and one game console permanently attached to it.
That looks
Really nerdy and boring.
Paul joked. Rebus discreetly pulled out his streamer, but Franklin gave him a cut-it-out signal. He would get them all thrown out after managing to earn a bit of trust. Moron. Nostos pointed at his own Game Boy and explained, in rapidly increasing volume.
So, Yokoi, to get these graphic levels, you'll need a contained 8-bit Z80 processor with a monochrome LCD display and 4-channel stereo sound. Eventually, you'll add color to the screen. No, I'm not joking.
Yokoi was already taking off the back of the smaller Game Boy's panel to examine its innards, like a surgeon on the operating table. He murmured sporadic O's and ICs every few moments.
I assume you're wondering how this could possibly be a reliable portable console with a drain that would be put on the batteries. My friend, you solved that one too. Use a system on chip with a DMG CPU, instead of using separate chips like you have it set up now. You'll use less power, and it will hide most of the components. I see. Yes. But if this is something I invented in the future, how did you get it? We traveled here, from the future, using the Game Boy.
Nostos explained in painful detail how he used the Game Boy to detect portholes to other places.
Like a map of real-life warp zones. Wait until I tell Miyamoto-san. Are you saying that my Game Boy will allow for time travel to be possible in the future? Only a select few of them. That's why we came here, to learn how an alien element made its way into rare copies of your handheld console. One that allows us to detect shortcuts through time and space using Tetris.
Yokoi admitted that he had no idea what Nostos could have meant. The two wandered into their own little world as Nostos clarified the reason he became interested in the Game Boy was because of its portability and its initial release with Tetris. In particular, how the shapes were reminiscent of an alien language the Flovatar Lab's delivery crew had encountered on the rogue planet back in the year 4975. Yokoi clarified that the game was created by a Soviet computer engineer. The Flovans should aim to go there to learn more about why Tetris was connected to portholes. They were like two shy kids on the first day of summer camp, finding a kindred spirit in an unlikely place.
Hello? Are either of you going to share your information, or is this a first date that we're interrupting?
What does this alien element look like?
When Nostos described it, Yokoi began to giggle until he got the hiccups. He led them back to the front desk and asked the receptionist to show them her new necklace that her boyfriend had gifted to her. She pulled out the long chain from under her shirt, and at the end gleamed a jagged red jewel.
We need to take it, right?
Gellin asked.
Of course not. It needs to be integrated into the production of consoles, so that I find it in the future and use it to get back to the future.
Gellin watched as hundreds of spotted, stout creatures mingled underwater in front of the Nintendo building. He hadn't eaten in what seemed like years, and his philosophlo began to explain that the swimming organisms in the pond were fish, similar to what people were eating in the company cafeteria. Without letting it finish, he plunged his hand into the water and grabbed 3 koi to stuff into his mouth.
Is he supposed to eat those?
Paul asked one of the horrified executives. The Nintendo employees backed away slowly and scurried into the building. Yokoi seemed not to notice, as he furiously programmed the Game Boy with fervid flicks of his fingers.
Here, I normally would not condone this, but I feel that I can trust you after all the help you have given me. I have been working on the back door to its programming. Mostly, so I can reset facets of the games without having to write new code. I'm the only one who knows how to hack. But with any luck. Ah, yes, there we go. Thank you, future me. I've altered the so-called impossible level of Tetris so that it will spit out information with a single move. You'll be able to see upcoming portal locations up to 500 kilometers away every time you place a tetramino. It looks like one is opening to Moscow in 4 hours. Oh my. But it's in Tokyo. Hurry, let's get back to the train, and don't make any other stops.
Yokoi tenderly handed Nostos the Game Boy, like he was leaving his firstborn child for their first day of school.
One last question I have for you, Yokoi. Every first-generation Game Boy comes with Tetris or Super Mario. I understand the love for the Italian plumber, but why Tetris?
Yokoi clasped his palms together, and let his eyes wander toward a burgeoning cherry blossom tree.
I've been fighting to include Tetris as the first Game Boy cartridge because the game trains our brains to understand patterns and create new neural pathways. It is like exercise for your brain. Every time you work the muscles in your body, you must balance it out with critical thought and imagination. It's the only way we continue to grow.
Yokoi shepherded the group back to the train station, directing them to a bullet train that would quickly take them to the Porthole location in Tokyo. They each bowed toward Yokoi as they stepped aboard the train.
Hey, Flovatars, before you go, we're working on this idea for another game. It's called Pocket Monsters, and players will start the game with one of the monsters as a pet. The trouble is, we can't decide which of these monsters the player will get at the beginning.
He showed them 2 figurines that looked eerily similar to Psyche Lucky's.
Let them choose.
Fasco shrugged, as if it were the only answer imaginable. On board the speeding train, an automated cart rolled down the aisles, stopping at each row to offer more snacks and drinks.
I can see the steam coming out of your ears, Floyd.
Fasco taunted toward the droid in the seat next to her. While they whizzed by at 150 kilometers per hour through the Japanese countryside, most of them took a well-deserved nap. Franklin, on the other hand, couldn't help but unload a list of questions that had been bugging her since the night before to half-awake Gellet. Did Damas know the boosters could explode on a trip to Earth? Why didn't Flova have as many dust-rich things in places as before? Sure, they used it in products and technologies, but they had droid teams actively harvesting dust daily.
What were you doing as a cadet before this?
She asked Gellin.
Protecting the dust pipelines. Flova Labs didn't want anyone near them.
Reba stirred, and the streamer continued to capture this conversation. Franklin let her eyes droop and drifted into a nightmare. In it, Nostos, Pol, Gellin, and Rebus joined her in traveling through a porthole to a frigid day in 1985. They made it just in time. But as Rebus jumped through the porthole, he tried to use the streamer's steady stream feature for some action shots. When the last stitch of his black and white shirt went through the hole, the opening zip closed. Fasco and Floyd were left behind. When Franklin opened her eyes to her snowy boots, they weren't on the train. They were shivering in 3 feet of ice. The nightmare was real.